Hi, this is George Graybill again, reading from my memoir about my trip around the world in 1970 and 71, where I traveled from Honolulu to Palo Alto the long way. And I'd like to read chapter 9, um, which tells of my trip all over New Zealand by thumb. Chapter 9. Kiwis and Moas. Soon after I landed in Auckland, I checked my mail at general delivery. There was a letter from Linda. She had joined an urban commune in Menlo Park, and she had a job. I had a humorous card from Holly postmarked Palo Alto. I think the joke on the card was based on one of our half-serious pet names. Poopsie, I think. A few endearing comments, no details. I never heard from her again. I was more of a typical tourist in New Zealand than in any of the other countries I passed through, except that I hitchhiked almost everywhere. I did a lot of sightseeing because there was so much to see. It was all beautiful unless you had an aversion to sheep. There's more great scenery in New Zealand than in all of Australia, and maybe even more than in California. I spent a few days in Auckland because it was the first Western-style city I'd been in for months. Well, typical except for the sheep. Any slope too steep to build on was covered with sheep. I took a ferry out to some island on the bay and hiked around. In the neighborhoods, there were cute little shops that sold only fresh bread, cheese, and milk, and nothing else. I traveled from little else. I traveled from youth hostel to youth hostel by thumb. The hitching was the best I've experienced. There was some economic problem that I didn't understand that made it difficult to import new cars. The result was that there were a lot of beautiful old cars from the 30s and 40s on the highway. But best of all were the people who picked me up. If they were on their way home, they would invite me in for a cup of tea. It was the southern hemisphere winter, and I was getting colder as I moved south, so any chance to get warm was welcome. The youth hostel system there was very good, extensive and inexpensive. From hostel patrons, I learned which hostels were in the most interesting places. The first point of interest I headed for was the town of Rotorua. I went to the lake to see the black swans, shown here. After that, I went to a geothermal area to see the geysers and boiling hot springs. The sulfur fumes made the place smell literally like hell. I had been told about an interesting Maori church. Someone said there were amazing carvings and paintings inside that were some of the best examples of Maori art in New Zealand. I found the church, but as I approached it, something strange happened. There was a sort of foreboding in the air. The closer I got to the door, the more unwelcome I felt. I walked all around the church, but my apprehension persisted. I came back to the front door, but I couldn't approach it. I'm not the sort who is prone to psychic or supernatural experiences. This was real. I felt better as soon as I turned to leave, and here you can see the church. That night at the hostel, some happy people came in with wet hair. They said they had been to the hot springs. I hadn't heard about this, and I considered staying another day to go to the springs, but I was in the mood to keep moving. I was told that Taupo was nice, so I went there next. This was a ski resort town, also located on a picturesque lake. From Taupo, I headed for Napier on the southeast coast. I got as far as a small town in the mountains that was the high point on the route, and about halfway to Napier. It was cold and raining, and there was no traffic. I went into the restaurant of a small lodge to warm up. The waitress told me there was a hostel nearby, so I decided to spend the night and try hitching again in the morning. This was classified as a primitive hostel. It was half the price and had almost no comforts. I slept on the floor beside the fireplace, which provided the only heat. The cold woke me up every time the fire went out. I was the only guest. The next night, I went to a small museum nearby that the waitress had also suggested. No one was around, and I walked in the open door and was scared absolutely shitless. Just inside the entrance was a complete skeleton of a giant moa. It was 12 feet tall, and its vicious, gaping beak towered above my head. Later I read that they were once the major herbivore, and that their only predator was an eagle, also extinct, that weighed 500 pounds. From time to time, there's an unverified report of someone catching a glimpse of a moa. I really hope these reports aren't true. Here's a picture of the moa. It was still raining. I started hitching in both directions and got a ride back to Taupo. I traveled south to Wellington, the capital of New Zealand. Instead of going to a hostel, I went to an address someone had given me. It was supposed to be a house full of undergraduate college students who would be glad to put me up for a few days. It was, and they did. Being students, we all went immediately to the nearest pub to get acquainted. It was all very jovial. The drug of choice for Kiwis students turned out to be hard cider. I assume because it was the cheapest way to get drunk. It seems that pot had not arrived yet. Someone complained that when something new came along, the New Zealanders were the last to hear of it. The route, they said, was United States to Britain to Australia to New Zealand. In the mornings in Wellington, the air was fragrant with wood smoke. Wood seemed to be a very common fuel for home heating. In some homes, the only heat source came from a wood stove in the kitchen. As I mentioned, many hitched rides ended in the driver's kitchen, gathered around a wood stove drinking tea. Always tea. Several times I heard the line that New Zealanders were more English than the English. One of the students, I think his name was Carl, talked me into going backpacking with him. The next day, we set out for a tract of wilderness just north of the city. Carl parked the car at a trailhead, and we set out. In just minutes, we came to a river that was wide and swift, but shallow. Carl said, "I like to get my feet wet right away and hike that way all day." I waded in, and he waded in. I followed his lead, but with misgivings. We were hiking through what I think would be classified as temperate rainforest. Very dense, very green. Near the end of the afternoon, we came to a crude cabin. It was just a corrugated metal shack with a fireplace and sleeping platform raised above the dirt floor. We shared it with a few other trekkers, Boy Scouts, I think. After a lengthy struggle, we got a meager fire started. I think deer hunters used these shacks. Deer hunting was encouraged by the government because deer were considered an invasive species. Having no natural predators, they had overpopulated both islands. Deer hunting was a fairly common profession that I learned about from one of them who gave me a ride. He was robust and then some. He described hiking far into the wilderness with a full pack and a rifle. Shooting and cleaning a deer and hiking out with 70 pounds of meat. The price of venison was high enough to provide a reasonable income. The next day we took a different route back to the car. It included a very scary swinging footbridge across a ravine high above a raging river. I enjoyed this wilderness almost as much as the Hawaiian rainforests. My friend Stan, who I've mentioned earlier, offered the opinion that the difference between a rainforest and a jungle is that jungles have leeches. Back in Wellington, I tried to book a passage on the ferry to the South Island and learned that it wasn't running. The reason was that at this time, in the middle of the winter, the sea is too rough. My only choice was to fly from Wellington to Nelson. I took off next day. The man in maybe his 40s settled into the seat beside me and introduced himself. We had a nice conversation, and he invited me to stay at his house in Dunedin if I got that far south. Dunedin is the most southerly town of any size. Our conversation was very brief because the strait separating the main islands is only 15 miles wide. Once again, someone had just invited me into his home. I don't get it. I'm just not that endearing. The next place I remember stopping was Christchurch. Everyone uses the word charming, lovely, English, relaxed to describe the city. It feels like nothing bad could happen here, which is why the earthquake of 2016 seemed so shocking and undeserved. I dropped my pack at a hostel and headed out to see the sights. There was a large park near the center of town that you can see here, with a little river meandering through it. I rented a little boat and spent the afternoon rowing up and down the river. I wound my way through a botanical garden, past the park boundary, and off through neat, peaceful neighborhoods surrounding the park. It was dreamlike to the point of unreal. Fairies and elves dancing along the shores would have been no surprise. The next stop I remember after Christchurch was a hostel at the foot of Mount Hood. At 12,218 feet, it is the highest peak in the country. It attracts a lot of skiers, and the hostel was actually a sort of low-cost ski resort. Some skiers get flown up to the top of a very long glacier and ski down it for miles and miles. It costs an arm and a leg. Back on the road again, I headed for Queenstown to the south. This is another ski resort town. The people who picked me up continued to be interesting. One old Scotsman gave me a ride in an ancient car that looked like something out of Downton Abbey. His accent was so thick that I understood almost nothing he said. We enjoyed each other's company in spite of the fact that we weren't really communicating. The ride that took me into Queenstown was in a Mercedes full of rich people. They were very humorous. One conversation went something like this. I wonder, Ronald, what would we do if we hit a sheep with the car and killed it? Well, Samantha, we could eat it, couldn't we? But we'd have to peel it first. I don't know how to do that. I don't think peel is the correct term, dear. I stayed in a small hotel made of bottles. I don't know why it was made of bottles, but it was. It was a beautiful town on a beautiful lake. I checked out the pubs that night. Nothing very interesting happened. And the next day, I went skiing. I had spent one winter of my life skiing in Michigan. Skiing was okay, but I wasn't crazy about it. I thought this might be my last chance in a while to ski, so I hitched to the closest ski slope. The same people in the Mercedes picked me up. I say, it's good to see you again. You just don't give up, do you? I rented skis and took the lift up the hill. The snow wasn't very good that day. The weather had turned unseasonably warm and the snow was too wet. I haven't skied since. I started to work my way back to Christchurch. I hitched to Alexandra, which I remember as drab and uninteresting, with the exception of an enormous clock on the hillside overlooking downtown. I went to a pub and played darts with some local blokes. I was about as skilled at the game as they, which they found simply miraculous. They seemed to think that being a good dart player was somehow congenital and went with the culture you were born into. I decided to pass on the invitation to Dunedin. It was cold this far south in the winter, so I decided to treat myself to a train ride back to Christchurch. The train went to the east coast and then followed the coastline north. The best part was that it was a steam train. It was exciting watching the engine chug along the rugged coast high above the ocean. I spent most of the trip talking to a young man from Toronto. As we approached Christchurch, he told me about his plans for 1984. There was some fear at the time that the future would definitely be Orwellian. The Canadians said that people were agreeing in advance to meet somewhere on New Year's Day 1985 to discuss just how much the year 1984 had resembled the novel. The places people chose to meet were iconic locations like the top of the Empire State Building, as in An Affair to Remember. He had already agreed to meet several people at the north corner of the north pylon of the Eiffel Tower. I said, "I'm into it. I'll see you there." Early in 1984, my old friend Marie was moving back to Paris. I asked if she could do me a favor, and I told her about a meeting with the Canadian that I had decided to skip. "Could you leave a note?" "Oh, Dick, forget about it. No one really goes to those romanticized meetings." And then she tried to sell me her old Volvo. On the plane from Christchurch to Sydney, Linda was on my mind again. What was I thinking? Was I really considering reviving the marriage? I was free from whatever I had thought had been restricting me, but I had to admit I wasn't really happier. Okay, New Zealand was pleasant in the way that Thomas Kincaid's paintings are pleasant, but it had really been more of a vacation from harsh reality. And then, as always, vagrant thoughts. My recently late friend Stan once said, "An adventure is when something goes wrong." Correct. Compare the events of these very different chapters. Chapter 1 was exciting and engaging and interesting. The previous chapter was boring. Adventure and happiness are not compatible, at least not for me. They only seem so in retrospect. If you wrote a memoir in which word count was exactly proportional to time elapsed, no one would read it. Bear with me. A lot of things are about to go wrong.